Welcome to the Soilcraft Regen Agronomy Podcast. At Soilcraft, our mission is to innovate and lead in the field of regenerative agronomy, forging a path that empowers farmers to produce food that nourishes and heals both the planet and its inhabitants. All right, good morning and welcome to Regen Radio. This week we tackle compaction. What were you saying, Craig, about compaction?
I was saying, I think that compaction may be a myth.
A myth? Oh, come on, man. Like, everyone has seen compaction. We've all driven in a field and then looked at look, there's the wheel tracks and the crop is struggling. See? Compaction.
Compaction exists, right?
So what is compaction then? Doesn't that beg the question?
And that's the question. To me, clay is so fine that can you really compact clay? Well, at least when I play with clay, I mean, you get a lump of clay in your hand and you hit it, you can displace it and you can mold it, but can you really compact it to be more dense than it is?
And what is compaction? I mean, if we describe it, it's kind of like saying what is wetness, right? Like that's an emergent property. And you could argue that compaction, maybe we're arguing, is an emergent property. Because when so what's the problem with compaction? I think if we talk about the problem with compaction, then we really know what we're talking about. The reason compaction is a problem is because what? Soil particles are too close to each other, which restricts root growth and takes away what we know is supposed to be occupying 50% of healthy soils, which is air, oxygen for respiration. So compaction really is what? It's the elimination of pore space, of oxygen, and for spaces for our roots to grow down into and to store water, etc., right? Yeah. So when you were saying about it being a myth, we're not saying that it doesn't exist, the condition doesn't exist in our soils by which roots struggle to grow and we have anaerobic conditions. We're not saying that, right? So what are we saying? Why are we saying maybe it's a myth?
Well, I mean, think about the common concept. So like I have, good friends who I provoke regularly with my no-till antics, saying no-till is better. And they'll come back and say, yeah, but there's so many places with sand where they've gone no-till and they have compaction and they just can't do no-till on those sands. Sand's compacting? Really? And they're talking about people with sandy soil for sure. But, when you talk about compaction, I mean, think about ripping. You're going to do a heavy rip. What's one of the main things people talk about? Well, wait till June or July when the soil is dry so you don't get the sidewall smearing. Sand is sidewall smearing? So is it really the sand compacting or is there something else going on? And I think something else is going on from what I've observed. I mean, one of the examples we have mildly heavy clays, not black cotton, but we have a good clay content. And in one of our more clay areas in the field, we did a side-by-side thing with bananas. And whenever we prepare a new banana field, historically we would cross-rip the field in the dry season. And so we had done two things. We had one field that was cross-ripped, and then next to it, I ran out of time to cross-rip because rains came and you don't want a sidewall smear. And so we planted a mixed cover crop and we planted deep-rooted things like sorghum and sunflower and black sun hemp and these things. And Denver can tell you what he observed. We're talking about side-by-side trials, literally adjoining field lines, exactly the same soil types. And tell me what you found out with your penetrometer.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, right? I think it was about 3 months into the banana crop. These young bananas and they all look good. I mean, both sides of the field look good. But you can just feel a difference, right? You walk in the side that had the cover crop and you're like, this field feels healthier. And you couldn't see it in the bananas as much as you could see it in what was growing in between the bananas in the rows between. But so you take the penetrometer out and I go into the part with the cover crop and boom, thing sails. I bury it. Doesn't go over 200 PSI. Roots can penetrate freely. Like, oh, that's awesome. That's cool. Okay, now we go over to the mechanical rip and it sails until you hit the bottom of where you mechanically ripped. Sure enough, and at that, I think we only, how deep were you ripping like 50 centimeters probably.
But between 50 and 70 centimeters.
Yeah. And so you hit that, boom, you hit that layer and whoa. And then you fast forward a couple months later, worse. You only go 30 centimeters and you hit that layer. But wait a minute, we ripped deeper than this. And we hadn't harvested, so there's been no field traffic, right? There's been no one in those fields creating compaction, right? And we hadn't done anything. We hadn't done any other mechanical tillage in that field. Nothing had been done. How did that compaction layer reform if it was from field traffic, if it was from tillage? There was none.
There were no cattle in the field. There was no physical reason.
We see this over and over again. I mean, even back in Washington, historically, my family farm, especially to the east of us, as you get closer anyways to some of our neighbors, they had what we call caliche. And caliche it's kind of it's not like gypsum, but it is. It's a calcium. And what it is it forms at a certain layer. And so we had this neighbor who would go out with the biggest ripper and biggest tractor you could find and rip these things up. And you'd have chunks.
Mountains, yeah.
Chunks in this field, boulders of caliche. It wasn't rocks. And they would spend the rest of that season breaking them into pieces, trying to get these big chunks of rocks. It wasn't rock, but broken down. And they'd break it down by the end of the year, and they would plant into it. And then you literally give it a few years' time, and what happens? It disappears. It's gone. You can't find any of those white chunks on the soil, anywhere in the soil. And what has reappeared? The compaction layer at the same level. And it's not at the layer, in this instance, it's not at the layer that we were only tilling, about 4 to 6 inches deep. And it reforms down at about 30 inches, 28 inches. And so it's chemical. So, and when we say chemical, what does that mean? Okay, yeah, so it's clay. We have clay particles in the soil, but we also have calcium, magnesium. We have our bases, sodium, potassium, these bases. And we know it's kind of like oil and water. You put oil and water together, and what happens? They separate out. And the same thing happens with these minerals in our soil. You add water and time, and the minerals that are in your soil will interact in various ways, and you can have these layers that form. They will separate out over time. And magnesium is one of the bigger offenders of that. And so, so what are some of the solutions? Like, obviously, we can go
gypsum
rip the field.
Like crazy.
Well, we can gypsum. We could rip the field, which is temporary relief. Feels great. Yeah. We see these chunks, we've done something, and it does. It lets water go in, it lets air come in. And if you do it right, you do it when it's dry, and you get maybe one of those, vertical shank with the duck foot, and you get right into that layer, and it heaves, and it drops, and it shatters. Don't get me wrong. You can more effectively do ripping, and you will see results for 1 or 2 seasons, but it's always coming back. And so then the question is, okay, what? So like you said, gypsum. Gypsum is a no-brainer. Why? Because sulfur from the gypsum interacts with magnesium, which oftentimes the problem is the calcium-magnesium imbalance, which we have here. So the sulfur interacts with magnesium. We get calcium or magnesium sulfate, Epsom salt. They like to, and what happens? That sulfur goes and attaches to it and releases it from the soil so that calcium, because gypsum's calcium sulfate, calcium can replace it. So it's a bait and switch. And it can work, and it does work well. It can be very effective to a point, but the sulfur can only do so much lifting, and then the problem often always comes back, where you can end up with excesses because you're shifting in one direction. So gypsum can be a good solution. Calcitic lime can be a good solution, and if your pHs aren't neutral or too high, I would argue they can be actually more effective at increasing that calcium level, because if we don't necessarily want to just flush our magnesium. Magnesium is essential. It's good. We don't want to deplete our bank. So calcitic lime can raise it, but we got to watch pHs. So what are some other, also you talk about issues. What are some of the issues with compaction and anaerobic conditions, right?
I think in our case, historically on the farm, it was every other or every third year cross-ripping your field. So let's just talk about the economic impact to your diesel fuel and your tractors. Very expensive, very hard, and you're having to do it every 3 years. Well, because you're driving on your field, yeah, okay, so you're running a spray rig. Are you running your spray rig with deflated tire pressures so that you have less compaction? There's things you can do, but you're having to do it over and over again. And for us, even with doing that, the problem was the compaction wasn't deep compaction. it was like a brick at the surface. And so, we shifted to the cover crops and we saw infiltration change. So it got better. We shifted to no-till and we had cover on the soil. It got better, but it was still a brick. So for us, there are a few things that changed. Obviously, biology. When we started having a more robust system of earthworms, driven by improved soil amendments, adding those carbons, adding those LABs and other biological elements back into our system, we saw it begin to change exponentially. But something else that was fun, I think it was about 2 years ago, we did a trial on the Rainbox system coming out of South Africa. And I've had probes in the same locations in wheat for about 5 years. You have the probes that go down about 1 meter. You've got different zones, water zones. And then there's an agronomist in South Africa that gives you a weekly report saying, hey, you're overwatering, you're underwatering, your root zone should be here. You're driving the nutrients below your root zone, all of that. And so we installed the Rainbox, and we had run it for about, I think it was just under 3 weeks. And I get a report from the agronomist in South Africa, and he says, hey, you need to dial back your irrigation. You're way over irrigating. And I said, well, what does he mean by that? And I went back and looked at all of my as applied records, and nothing had changed. I was applying it the same amount of water that I had been applying for the weeks before. And so I got looking, and I realized almost to the day, not to the day, it takes a little while to have an effect, but within that 2 week period, the water that I was applying using the Rainbox system had opened up pores in the soil. So now I could use less water and it was more absorbable. My nozzles were cleaner. There wasn't the calcium buildups on them. And you saw the impact of that. And for me, I'm convinced, especially this year, you go back out, that between the biology, between the roots, that adding that water treatment system, we're now getting the benefit of our calcite and our calcitic lime. And I don't need to go out and rip. So I'm saving money, I'm saving effort, and I'm actually saving structure, which is why I said maybe compaction's a myth, because I'm trying to think, where in the natural world do you find compaction? You don't find it in the Great Plains of the world outside of a salt pan. So is a salt pan compaction?
Yeah, it's chemical though.
It's chemical. Yeah. So yes, there are places in the world that are too hard to grow plants, but it's not a lack of steel that's the problem. It's a lack of biology, it's a lack of life, or a lack of cover on the soil. And so for me, I'd be interested. I'm not a soil expert, and there are those. Maybe we can talk to someone who can, cure me of my fallacy if there is one. But I'm not convinced that there's actually mechanical compaction that's persistent. I do think you can compact stuff driving on it. You can drive in the field with a sprayer rig, and you can see that it's lower than the other. But my question is will it stay that way? Mm-hmm. Well, in my experience, if you have living roots, you have biology that's active, you have moisture there, that goes away. And you can say, well, okay, we've got black cotton soil. Well, it's true. Black cotton soil is a shrinking clay, okay? So when it gets dry, it does what? It shrinks. So pieces of it tighten, and it opens up big, wide gaps in the soil, breaks roots, does all that stuff. Well, what happens when you add water? Well, it melds and molds back together. So if you go and shatter that in the dry season, and then you add water, are you really solving it through a mechanical process? Or is this really, again, a chemical situation? And we're talking about heavy clays. And you go to the other extreme and you talk about sands, and can you really compact sand? I mean, I don't think you can actually compact sand alone. You might be able to get a chemical, aggregate that includes sand to turn into sandstone. And you say, well, that's compacted. Well, that's true, but it's not the sand, and it's not physical compaction. It's a chemically bound situation. So that's my hypothesis. And if you don't like it, send a message and let's talk about it. But
maybe a shout out to Isaac Madsen. Maybe we can get Mr. Soil in here, since he's just in Lusaka, to elaborate on this.
We need to do it.
Because, and that's to your point exactly. We forget, we struggle because we always see things in physical terms, but we forget often that that really we're still talking about electromagnetism, and all of these soil particles have charges. We know that soil has a negative charge and our bases have a positive charge. But, we try and imagine this and think, well, that's crazy, Well, it wouldn't be crazy if I put a jar here and filled it full of magnets. They would all be attracted to and repelled. You know what I mean? There would be attraction and repulsion. And that would form this. And if they all aligned in a certain matter, they would compact into a ball. And if they align into another matter,
we call that tungsten.
They would fly apart. Exactly. The density is greater. They'd fly apart. And that's really what's happening in soil. So I really think probably to a larger extent, even when we talk about compaction in sands, there's still that clay or mineral component of those bases and the positive and negative charges that are creating either the tightness or the looseness. And that's why we know that we apply gypsum. The calcium, what does it do? How does it interact with soil particles? It makes them align vertically. And when they align vertically, then it allows water in and air out. And magnesium does the opposite. They align horizontally, stack on top of each other. So when you go with a shovel and pop it up and you see compaction, what do you see? Plating. You see all these layers of plates where they want to fracture in that capacity. And rightly so, we can go out with a ripper, we can rip it and we can break those, and those sheets come apart, but they're still sheets. They're sheets on sheets. And that's one of the other big problems I have with it. Okay, we can alleviate it mechanically, but when we alleviate it mechanically, the particles are still tight to each other. It's just we've spaced out chunks of particles. We haven't given the roots, we haven't given fungi access to soil particles, individual particles. And that's why I think we see such an amazing response with the Rainbox. Why? Because we see calcium and sulfur, gypsum, reacting with the soils. Calcium positive, sulfur negative, and they react with things, positive and negative charges. And we need these. So I'm not saying that we don't look at that anymore. Absolutely we do. We need calcium, and so we can add calcium. But what we see with this is, especially in irrigated systems, you're going to be watering anyways. And so the water changes the water. Yeah, it's better. But then what's really happening is you have the pluses from the hydrogen, the H plus, or carbonic acid, which has a positive charge. And then you have the hydroxyl radicals, OH minus, that form from the ozone. And so you have the negative charge. And so what are you doing? You're actually putting both in. So you're having positive and negative charges, and it's from hydrogen and oxygen, which are both non-matter, which gets really fuzzy, but you know what I mean? They're not a metal. Yeah. We have gases that are exchanging. And so it's a very inert, if you will, way to change the nature, the way your soil is working, and to actually facilitate changes at a local level that have a global impact. Because you go out there and, okay, yes, so water does make black cotton soils. They go from a brick to not a brick. But without making these changes through the base saturations and through treatments like the Rainbox, when they're wet, they're still tight. When they're wet, they're slimy. You've put those soils in, and they tend to be anaerobic, and you slip and slide around on them, or they build up and you become a foot taller by the time you get out of the field. And so let's think biologically, and let's think chemically instead of just thinking mechanically. And when we do, I think we'll see that we can actually make permanent or more permanent changes to this temporary problem.
So I've got a challenge for you. There's a farmer here listening to this whose hair's on fire, screaming, "You don't know my field. Just come take a look." Just take a section, a small piece of your field. Go plant that diverse cover crop on there. Rip next to it. Put some extra biology on it, and come back in a year or 6 months and decide for yourself. See if there's anything to it, because if it is, it might mean a big increase to your bottom line.
You remember, sorry, I know we should wrap it, but you remember on the wheat a couple of years ago, we had the guys were working on a wheel motor or something, and there was a fire, and the fire ripped across, a quadrant of the field. And I was amazed at the compaction in that field. That had nothing to do with mechanical. The residue was burned off. The sun was beating on that soil. And that quadrant of that pivot had compaction for almost 2 years following. And what was amazing to me about that is that the only thing that had changed was the removal of the residue and the impact of the sun on that soil, beating on that soil. And so remember, we had compaction there for almost 2 years, but then we had a problem show up in the field in the subsequent crop, which was we had amaranth that was really beating you up. And what was miraculous is you go out there with a soil penetrometer, and where the fire was and where the fire was not, it was night and day compaction. But what was also amazing was when you'd go next to amaranth or pigweed, you go 2 or 3 inches from that root, you just sail straight down. Because the root exudates, which tend to be mostly acidic, but they're not always, plants make hydrogen peroxide, they make acid. Those exudates are actually transforming the soil at a chemical level, which is alleviating compaction. And that's amazing.
So what you're telling us is that weeds sometimes are the earth speaking back to us.
I didn't say it. All right, thanks so much. You tell us what you think about compaction. Give us your instance and maybe some of your solutions. Maybe there's some solutions we didn't mention here. Thanks very much. See you next week. Thanks so much for joining us as we expand our paradigms and explore what's possible in the realm of regen agronomy. If you would like to contact us or learn more about what we do, please visit our website at www.soilcraft.com, as well as our YouTube channel. If you have topics you would like us to unpack or stories, please connect with us so that we can share them with others.